This is a panel session focusing on equity and learning as critical educational goals. So the focus is very, very particularly equity. That's what we're going to be thinking about and talking about in this session. Now, obviously, we are a little bit behind with time, so having consulted with my panel colleagues and with the PLA organisers, what we've decided to do is to aim to finish by 1:45 at the latest, so a little bit later, but not as late as if we had taken the full amount of time that was originally planned. We're skipping a little bit of what we had intended to do, but the event will still be full of interest and challenge, hopefully. What we've decided to do is to begin with brief presentations from each of the panel members, and then we're going to go straight to opening it up for what we hope will be a discussion amongst all of us, not just a question and answer from the panel, but we're very happy indeed, we would encourage people on the floor who want to respond to a point that's been made on the floor to pick that up, so that we have a dialogue going about this, to me anyway, most important of topics, equity, in the equity and learning equation. I'm going to introduce the speakers very briefly because of time constraints, and I'm sure they will tell you more about themselves and their presentation as they speak. We have representatives from several countries: Yiannis Roussakis from Greece, John Portelli and Salvina Muscat from Malta, Giovanna Barzanò from Italy, Eszter Salamon, who is actually based in Hungary, but is here representing the European Parents Association, so a pan-European organization. And finally, Aggeliki Lazaridou, also from Greece. And we've tried to structure these presentations so each is from a different perspective on this focus of equity. So hopefully you will be hearing different viewpoints, different challenges, which we would then ask you to pick up in your response to what people are saying. We're going to attempt to keep strictly to time. So if you see me flashing bits of paper, that's just to alert panel speaker that they have a limited amount of time left. So we're starting with Yiannis, and we'll ask him to open our panel session.
Thank you, Jacky. In my intervention, I'm going to discuss the impact that what has been called the global education reform movement, or the global managerial educational reform, has on equity and learning. I'm going to divide my intervention into three parts. In the first part, I'm going to elaborate a little bit on the scope of and the content of these reforms, the main tenets of these reforms. I cannot draw an exhaustive list because of the nature of the germ. And the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit about how this kind of reforms has dominated education policy discourse and what is the connection to other policies. And on the third part of my intervention, I'm going to talk about how to actually develop an immunology against such kind of thinking, or contradicting this kind of thinking, especially in terms of equity and learning. So I'm using this definition of equity by Jacky, which I find very useful. Jacky defines equity as the process of doing more than securing equal opportunities and equal outcomes in education, and ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that will enable them to live a life they value, and the value it offers to society, without encountering the structural barriers of discrimination to determine the process. So actually, some people criticize this kind of definitions as neo-social sometimes, but I think that it actually captures all the essence of what is meant by equity And it actually defines the problems that someone will encounter towards equity when trying to think in the framework of the global education reform movement. Now, when I talk about the germ or the global education reform movement, I refer to policies and reforms that have this kind of characteristics that are shown in the slide. I'm talking about evidence-based politics, about what works, about assumptions that when discussing educational issues, all other things should remain equal, about advocating education for economic competitiveness, the establishment of accountability and quality assurance systems, irrelevant of the context of education, using neo-managerial strategies as education leadership strategies, advancing standardized testing and assessment, criticizing teachers and their quality, using value-added models for their assessment, focusing on certain curricular subjects rather than on the whole curriculum, advocating school autonomy on the one hand, but imposing steering mechanisms on the other, preferring public-private partnerships to public schooling, and decreasing educational funding by producing evidence that is loosely coupled with results. So this kind of thinking actually poses a heavy burden on education, and in my thinking, it actually composes what I would call a neoliberal policy-scape for education. Not all of the thinking is neoliberal, of course, but most of the things that the global education reform movement advances is very close to that kind of thinking. So international organizations, which are the main proponents of this kind of reforms, usually impose a heavy burden on education, saying, for example, look at that. This is coming from a publication of the European Union, saying that education is a safe haven against crises. But on the other hand, education financing is part of the national debt, and spending is cut in every crisis-ridden country. So, in my opinion, and what I'm going to argue, is that we need to develop some kind of immunology and resistance and depart from the logic of the germs towards a more locally relevant and community supportive thinking of education, encouraging practices that would support community rather than what is evidence-based policies. So in the Greek action plan that we're going to propose at the end of this project, we have come up with this kind of thinking, proposing the school as community hubs model, that the school is actually a part of the local community that serves the local community and supports it against any kind of neoliberal and selectively evidence-based policy. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yiannis. That was a provocative opening for our session. We pass now to John Portelli and Salvina Muscat from Malta.
Thank you, Jacky, and thank you all, and thank you to the organizers. This presentation is prepared by my colleague Salvina, Muscat, and I, but I'm going to be doing this presentation. We are also another panel at the end, and which we also prepared together, and then we will revert the order. Salvina will talk, and I will support. I am working both with the Ministry of Education in Malta for the last 7 years, but much more so intensely in the last 2 years. But I'm also a professor of education and leadership and policy at OISE at the University of Toronto. This presentation is, we will speak for 3 minutes on each, on the concept of equity and lessons learned from a continuous professional development program that Salvina and I developed, and in these we had given you an explanation of the content, assumptions, and so on. Now that we have enacted this with over 2,000 educators in Malta, including many, many educators in positions of leadership, we are in a position to reflect on that in relation to equity. I will also make use of 3 slides from another project that I am currently conducting in Toronto on graffiti in schools, which for me is very helpful if we want to get into robust equity. The work that we did in Malta follows very directly from the Framework for National Strategy on Education 2014-2024. It is very clearly written in the Ministry's policy directions that it wants to focus on certain crucial values, including that of education, with a pedagogy of hope and possibilities rather than a deficit mentality. The professional development program was very much focused on social justice, diversity, and equity from a critical democratic framework, which, of course, contrasts solidly from the neoliberal framework that Yiannis mentioned and critiqued. This is from a survey that I did with many schools in Toronto, and several students do but in a word, describe school hell. So let me say it very clearly. One of the major aims of focusing on equity is that we do not want schools to continue to be hell and reproducing hell for students. We obviously are not working from a neoliberal perspective. We are working from a critical democratic perspective that takes robust democracy very solidly. We are not afraid to dream, because if we do not dream, this is a graffiti in Brussels, round the corner from the major building of the EU, okay? If we want to take equity seriously, we cannot allow the suicide quotidienne to continue to reproduce itself. So, what concept of equity? Equity and social justice go together. And to unpack this concept, we use 3 further concepts, that of inclusivity, diversity, and equity. Inclusivity is not used because of political correctness. There are very good ethical reasons. We do not want to marginalize people. We want people to belong rather than feel in hell. And we therefore have to utilize a variety of criteria, or else we will fall into the trap of a deficit mentality, which is based on very colonialist principles of one size fits all. Diversity, a variety of diversities. Even if we believe that we are homogeneous, we also have to look at the varieties in that homogeneity as well. Equity is not the same as equality. The difference is this. Yiannis has already referred to it. Equality is based on equality of opportunity, which is a very liberal principle which has not worked in the last 150 years. It is based on sameness. Equity takes diversity and the context very seriously, so we need to keep this in mind. If you recall this cartoon, which we showed you in Nice, we feel we should show it to you again. When it comes to lessons learned, 4 things. They want more preparation. They urge us to do more work on equity because they don't have a good understanding, massive problems of deficit, and a variety of teaching styles. When we did a survey, and this is my concluding point, close to 70% of these educators learn best by doing. But when we ask them what method to use, learning by doing is the least they use. Final point, this is from my graffiti in a school. Someone wrote, money is the problem. And someone else wrote, we don't have money problems. Capitalism is the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We all laughed at that epithet, hell. But actually the reality of it is what we're talking about, that school really is hell for some children. And that's, in my view, the founding motivation of this network. So thank you very much for that. We move on now to Giovanni Barzanò from Italy.
Sorry, no. No, but I don't have the slides on. So, my contribution is from the angle of student leadership, and in particular from some experiences we undertook in order to value student voice, which are in continuation to a certain extent with my short presentation in the last PLA in Nice. We assume in our experience of a dialogue network in Italy, which is a network of some national network of some 30 schools, where we have hosted all the EPNoSL material and where we do some activity research, that valuing student voice is a main component and in a necessary component of distributed leadership for equity, but that it requires a very concrete focusing on tools and practices, and on the fact that there must be something at stake for the students rather than just simulations. We fight against the simulations involving students to pretend that they act as decision makers in the town hall or in other kind of initiatives, where in fact they clearly understand that it's just a game and there is nothing at stake for them.
It depends.
Okay. In the last presentation, I introduced a conceptual framework that I had derived combining the notion of critical events with the dimensions of distributed leadership for equity identified by Woods. And the notion of critical events is really important because these kind of events, as they have been described, are really essential to put something at stake from the student's perspective. Another interesting conceptualization, or better hints for practice, is the partnership typology described by Fielding. That is a very important tool, a very important checklist in the school planning to elicit what John Macbeth called the peer's power, because these are all fields of activity, the ones listed in the partnership typology, where indeed the power of peers comes to light and is engaged in the action. When we mean the students, when we see the students as a data source, as active respondents, as co-inquiries. But this, of course, requires a very strong engagement in the school in terms of planning and in terms of organization. The organizational demand of eliciting student power is something that schools sometimes forget, at least in our culture. Thank you. We did we are doing an interesting experience in Italy now in the dialogue networks. We have created a team blog, a sort of digital writing laboratory with a team blogging where clusters of free schools for 3 weeks discuss a topic. In particular, we are now focusing on identity, and we are asking the students we are asking them to tackle the question, who am I? How do I express myself? One question each week for 3 weeks, 3 classes from different corners of Italy discussing these issues. 59 classes so far. It was finished last week, I think. 1,400 students and 150 teachers involved. Some of them as class facilitators, some as observers. So we have 2 parallel blogs, one of the students where only the students are entitled to participate, and some for the teachers, where only the teachers are entitled to participate, and some of them are only snooping into the blogs and to comment on their impression on the students talking to one another. The fact is that we are also interviewing the students and the teachers, asking them what is the difference. You know, in Italy, the notion of essay is a very important pedagogical tool, and we asked them what is would you have got something different if you had given "Who am I" as a title for an essay, for a classic essay, or when you ask them to discuss with one another. And in fact, the teachers were very surprised at the enormous difference, because, and I conclude with this, you know, they realized how often we forget in the schools the peer dimension, the peer as an audience of an important message. And they said, of course, when they are not ashamed of what they say. They know that we are watching, reading what they do. But they are addressing their peers. And so many students, and this was an observation on the part of the teachers, who were very weak in the traditional writing, were very open and very expressive in this kind of writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's very rich, all these different perspectives, isn't it? It really is. We pass now to Eszter Salamon, who is going to give us something from a parental perspective.
Thank you, Jacky. I will start with repeating what I said in Vilnius, that, and I know that it's kind of provocative here, that regardless what the will or the initiatives of different governments and what the role of traditional school is, the people who are legally responsible for the education of their children are parents and parents only. According to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, there are 2 articles, 5 and 18, that explicitly say that parents are the solely responsible people. And of course, there is a shared responsibility because we're trusting the schools with sharing the education of our children. But for a parent, it's not a choice, but it's an obligation to be part of the education of their children day by day. We always see as European Parents Association that the traditional approach to school considers parents as a burden. It's an extra work for the teachers. But experience show that if it's dealt with in a proper way, it can actually be a relief when it comes to this overload of work that most of the teachers in Europe have. the experiences come in mass, mostly from healthcare, where parents of young children fought for their rights to be together with their children in the hospital. And first, the hospital staff really hated it, but then they realized that it's actually a relief for them. And I want to say, as a positive note, that healthcare systems and education systems are the two most difficult to change systems in the world. And I really hope that as we could change healthcare systems in the majority of European countries, we may be able to change education systems. But even in healthcare systems, it was a parent's initiative and it wasn't the doctor's initiative. At the same time, I have to say that when it comes to parental involvement, it is an absolutely bad approach, just like in healthcare, to consider parents as the customers who are ordering the service. Because, and this is also something that European Parents Association also have to raise our voices for, students, regardless their age, even if they are just 3-year-olds, they should be considered competent partners. Those student voice programs that we usually hear about, and they are great, I don't want to criticize it, they're usually about secondary school students. But we are advocating for involving the children even at a very early age, in an appropriate way. So, in our view, an equitable education system is a cooperation between the students, the learners, the teaching staff, the parents who are taking the most burden of the education, because in the school the child is for 6 hours, for the other 18 hours they're at home, and of course the environment. So we are very much promoting the idea of creating community learning spaces instead of schools. And I was really enjoying Ayatuna's presentation in one of the webinars. I actually invited her to the EPA conference, because that's the approach. I don't know how many of you have seen that webinar, but it's worth having a look. That's the approach that we really appreciate and promote. The big problem is, and it's a big issue for policymakers, for school heads, for teachers, that the majority of parents are not aware of this situation, mainly that they have the responsibility. They think that either their role is to somehow push through the children the education system, or to make the school responsible for the education of their children. So what we say and what we promote is the need for empowering the parents, which is also explicitly written in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, that parents need support in this role. It's a very big question how to do that, and it's especially a big question with parents with low socioeconomic status. But I also have to warn you that similar problems about parental involvement, about this obligation and feeling responsible, occurs with very high status parents, because they are just as likely to say, it's your responsibility. I pay for the school, I paid for the best, I have no concerns what's happening inside. As long as I pay, you have to do your job best. So we have to empower both kinds of parents, the ones who are maybe very low skilled, maybe unemployed for 10, 15 years, and also the ones who are very high status, because usually it's the middle who is getting it right, and it's a very, 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 very thin layer. I want to finish with a thought by Nora Ritok, who is an arts teacher who teaches in segregated Roma villages in the east of Hungary. And she's always saying that it's not enough to help the children. Why? It doesn't matter what kind of equitable conditions you create in the school, as long as the children have the role model of the parents, that somebody will eventually solve the problems. We don't have to do much about it. They will copy that role model. And this is very, very dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That puts a whole different context, I think, on our work. So thank you. And we have now Aggeliki Lazaridou from Greece.
Thank you, Jacky. I'm the last one, and I'm the last one, and this is going to be a crash test for me, because I usually, when I talk about these issues of leadership and equity with my students, it takes me about 2 to 3 hours. Now I have to do it within 6 minutes. So I hope I can work it well for you, so you can have some ideas for our discussion. I'm going to build on Joan's idea on deficit mentality, and hopefully I can bring together what Giovanna and Eszter talked about, parents and students, by talking about deficit thinking and transformative leadership. Those of you who are not familiar with the term, deficit thinking is synonymous to the process of blaming the victim, and it suggests that the students who fail in schools do so because of their internal deficits or deficiencies. And such deficiencies manifest in limited intellectual abilities, linguistic shortcomings, lack of motivation to learn, immoral behavior, and other problems. You might not be aware that this model, the deficit thinking model, is the longest held theory. If you turn into the literature, it spans over a century, where scholars, educators, and policymakers have used to explicate school failure among what we call disadvantaged students. So if now educators are to be successful in making schools more equitable for all students, they must deconstruct the images of students as problems, as unmotivated and uncaring, and replace these negative images with an understanding that all students as individuals are worthy of respect and support. The literature and research says that a good starting point towards that direction is a transformative leader. And here I'm distinguishing between a transformative, it is not the same a transformative as what we call transformational. 20 years ago, in a study by Wagstaff and Fusarelli, it was found that the single most important factor in the academic achievement of what we call disadvantaged students is the principal's explicit rejection of deficit thinking. Now, how is that deficit thinking gets eliminated? There is no special equipment, no special technique or program or even training to do so. What is needed is a dedicated educational leader who makes consistent and concerted efforts to keep his or her staff aware of their own deficit thinking and the need to overcome it. And again, the literature tells us that such a leader has the characteristics of a transformative leader. So very briefly, some of the key tenets of that transformative leadership are: they mandate to effect deep and equitable change, the need to deconstruct and reconstruct knowledge frameworks that perpetuate inequity and injustice, and an emphasis on interdependence, interconnectedness, and global awareness. So what do all of these mean in practice? Because I think we're interested mainly in practice here. They mean that for such a transformative leader, he has to start at the end, at the bottom. Such a leader has to recognize that inequities exist in every community, and they powerfully and detrimentally affect the possibility of equitable educational outcomes of all students. Transformative leaders combine careful attention to authentic personal leadership characteristics, a focus on more collaborative, dialogic, and democratic processes, and or leadership, and at the same time they attend to goals of individual intellectual development and goals of collective sustainability, social justice, and mutual beneficial civil society. And now I've finished, because I only have one minute, with a term that I borrow from Mackenzie and Zurich, who talk about equity traps. And I really like that because it presents a nice metaphor to avoid deficit thinking. And in their work, they present how principles can help teachers avoid and dismantle their deficit thinking by attending to these deficit equity traps. So the Mackenzie and Zurich define equity traps as ways of thinking or assumptions that prevent educators from believing that their disadvantaged students can be successful learners. And of course, the first one is the deficit view, the one I described earlier. And they present a number of ways so that teachers can avoid those traps, and have teachers, students, families, and community members working together to eliminate their deficits, their deficit thinking. And the purpose is to create a union where everyone learns about each other, and which solidarity and a sense of community are being built. So I'm going to stop here because Jacky is looking at me. And hopefully we will have more to talk in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Aggeliki, and thank you to all our presenters for being so good about giving sharp presentations. We've had perspectives, nevertheless, from parents, from staff, from students. We've had ideas about what prevents equity. We've had ideas about approaching increasing equity, how we might avoid equity traps, in Aggeliki's borrowed phrase. So I really appreciate they had such a short time to explain their ideas to you, but what we were all agreed on is we wanted to leave a lot of time for you to pick up where you wanted to ask them for more detail, where you wanted to respond, where you want to put something of your own into this debate about equity. And I remind us, this is about policy. So we're taking all this knowledge that has been presented today and accumulated throughout the work of EPNoSL to carry policy development forward to make schools more equitable places. So please, if you have a point to make, please raise your hand and there'll be a microphone. If you want to respond to that point, raise your hand, and I'll also be asking panel members if they want to join the debate or answer a question or make a point in response to what you're saying. So let's try and get a debate going rather than a more turgid kind of question and answer. That's the aspiration. Help us.
I appreciate the positions of each one of the presenters. What I think was not touched upon at all, which in my view should be touched upon, is the dimension of gender in the promotion for equity and learning. And I know in EPNoSL we did not engage in thinking on the issue of gender. And perhaps that can be a recommendation from this session for further review, analysis, thinking, so we can include it in the recommendations we need to present at the end. I know Jacky is concerned with and perhaps has worked in the area of gender and equity in learning, and I'd like to have your position on it.
Well, I'm not the only person here who's worked on gender. Aggeliki also may have something to say about this. I'd be interested in the audience's view. In fact, I was speaking to Jerry this morning about our disappointment that explicit discussion of gender and ethnicity had not been more central in the work of the network, and perhaps it's not too late to do that. There are, of course, a whole range of grounds on which discrimination or disadvantage, from which the response of people creates disadvantage. But the thing about gender is it affects everybody. It affects all women and all men. So I guess it's central. There's been a lot of work done on gender, much of it what I have called lamenting. We have lots of narratives of how disadvantaged women on the whole are, and to some degree men, by gender stereotyping and so on. We have not had quite so much work on ways forward to try to break through this beyond kind of obvious steps to do with childcare and so on. So I think there's a whole load of policy work to be done on how we extricate ourselves. I don't know if Aggeliki wants to add anything.
Well, I can say that because Jacky and I were working a part of an international group where we study gender issues. And I see that what Kathy said, as another deficit trap. So there is, I do believe too that we need to do a lot of work and bring more issues of women in terms of whether they're disadvantaged or not, and how equitable opportunities they have as compared to men. We do a lot of work as part of that network internationally, and hopefully it's not easy. There are no easy answers to that issue of gender, but we have to continue working towards that to bring more equity on that front. So, yes.
Just 2 weeks ago, I was presenter at the gender conference in Zurich, and I analyzed all our project data on school turnaround and organizational change on 3,000 personality data sets we have about school leaders, and I have to say I don't find much differences. There are significant differences, but they don't matter much. But there's one crucial fact, and that's about promotion dynamics, and it's about recruitment. So if gender, from my perspective, then it's why it is given the relation between teachers and principal completely the opposite way. And I'm not sure, I don't have European data on that, but for the German-speaking countries, if you look on personality, if you look on change and a lot of things, so little differences, but if it comes to appointment, huge difference.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thanks to all the panelists for the insights you have shared. Just 3 quick points. First of all, on gender, definitely, I agree, Kathy, that's an important area we should explore further, including the gender pay gap, for example. The proportion of men and women in leadership positions is an important aspect. But let's also, in the same vein, not forget about the other dimensions of diversity. Very important. What about the issue of ethnic minorities? The Roma, for example, this is a real issue in Europe. What about the issue of disabilities? What about the issue of the student body, which is becoming more and more diverse? We have students from all over the world in our schools, and quite often when we talk to our members, the teachers, they tell us the education they receive in universities does not prepare them for the diversity they experience in the classroom. These are the real issues. How do we deal with that? And then the second point relates to the involvement of parents. As a parent myself and a teacher, I highly appreciate the need for parents to be part of this decision-making process in school. and you talked about coming up with some learning spaces in the community replacing schools. Yes, I would say as a complement, but not to replace a school. The school remains an important institution and it has an important role. In fact, the latest report from UNESCO, Rethinking Education, reaffirms the critical role of the school and the teacher. And then the final comment relates to the global education reform movement, the germ. It's a real germ or virus, if you like, which is spreading with cutthroat, dog competition. Now, the problem with competition, as we all know, is that it creates winners and losers. Our schools should not have winners and losers. Everyone must win. I was in South Korea last week at the World Education Forum, and then the government of Korea, for example, painted a glowing picture of one of the best education systems in the world. And then one of the teachers who was in the audience stood up and said, "Let me tell you about the dark side of the Korean education system." And the students, meanwhile, were demonstrating, giving out leaflets describing the real Korean education system, which starts from about 7:30 in the morning and ends about midnight, with extra tuition, private tuition, and so on, with high rates of suicide. All that is as a result of competition. They're high on PISA, but at what cost? So we really need an antidote to this germ, collaboration, working together, make the school not hell like I saw on one of these slides, but a place where children will have joy, the joy of learning and look forward to every day. So these are some of the critical issues we must really grapple with and come up with clear recommendations which could be considered by our governments.
Okay, I'm going to be very quick. I wrote this down so I wouldn't wander. I think there's just three things I want to say. The first thing is I'm really delighted that somebody brought up deficit thinking and challenging deficit thinking, and the length of time that's been going on in and of itself is an indicator of the fact that we haven't been dealing with it. And I think it's at the core of everything, because all of the things we're talking about today share that one core area. All of, whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality, whether it's race, ethnicity, and how schools view those different groups is very often coming from a deficit perspective. Often a very normative perspective on the part of schools and school leaders, and the extent to which normalization as an activity within schools sometimes it compounds the notion or even causes the notion of deficit thinking. I would also like to talk a little bit, one thing about leadership. I think we have to be really careful to challenge the normative nature of much of the conversations we're having about leadership and the extent to which they are not challenging these key issues like deficit thinking. And then I'm going to put a spanner in the works. That's an Irishism, I think. Because I am really getting more and more. I'm in schools for the last 3 months working with school leaders and doing research on school leaders. And more I'm coming to a point where I really think we need to challenge the notion of leadership as something in the background. I actually don't agree. I see the work I've been seeing in schools is exactly the reverse. I think our view of background is somewhat narrow and maybe not fully defined, but some of the work I have seen on leadership in the last 3 or 4 months has been very much maybe background activity, but it is out front in terms of what it's doing around the school. And also I think the Michael's video on the conductor, I'm not 100% sure that I would agree that a school leader is not like a conductor, because some of the work I've seen, I think we could go back to that. And I'm not talking about bringing back the heroic, I'm talking about that need to set goals and expectations and move things on. So that's it. That's a whole load of stuff in there. Who's next?
Well, I'm just going to give one or two panel members a chance to respond to the range of points that have been made. Excellent points coming from the audience, and just very briefly, if we may.
Kathy, gender and migration are top priorities besides gender, sexuality, are top priorities in the agenda in Malta, because we're struggling. When it comes to migration, the challenges of including all is the reality when you live it day by day. And you have to go to the different schools to see it happen. I mean, I think we have to also plan the way forward for such eventualities, which are realities. They are no dreams. They are realities in our schools. And they have had such a big impact on the schools in Malta that they are no longer, schools are no longer surviving. We need real support. We need teachers are all the time asking us to help them out. So I think we have to figure out how equity is to figure in such situations.
I just want to reflect on replacing or complementing schools. I fully agree that nobody wants to replace school, but as long as we started the day with what are the desires of people. Mihail Stratz presented that the basic desire is to have a good job. And as long as what schools are preparing students for, good results in standardized tests, is the complete opposite of what employers want them, and those skills can be learned informally and non-formally, it's wrong. And it's also wrong that 20-25% of students in some countries are getting special education needs label, which means that there is no problem, there is no deficit in the students, there is a problem with the system. And this is why I say that somebody has to really push for a real change. And I just want to add one thing that should be considered. We are talking about migration, but from our point of view, what is missing is talking about migration within the EU. As long as one of the core values of the EU is mobility of workforce, the fact that our students, our children, are lacking tuition in their national culture and issues around that, if you move to another country, and in many cases they also have to repeat a year, it's a restriction to the basic value of the EU of mobility. So it should become part of the discourse. We have, I hope, managed to put it on the agenda of the new serious network.
Thank you. It seems to me that the debate is kind of running on two levels here. One to do with specific challenges, to do with migration, for example, gender and so on, and the other, how we conceive of leadership best able to meet what I would call the moral challenge here. Is it leadership in front, leadership behind, and so on? So there's those two strands going. So I wonder if the audience wants to come in and develop those ideas. I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Jacky. Two quick points in relation to the conversation we are having. The whole issue, of course, of deficit mentality, as the colleague from Ireland pointed out, is very much related to the whole issue of what counts as normal. Okay? So two things about possibilities, Jacky, that I have experienced or I am experiencing at the moment in Malta, and that is when it comes to issues of evaluation and assessment, which is very much related to a way of possibly controlling what we consider to be normal or abnormal in schools. Malta is at the stage of trying to actually develop different forms of evaluation and assessment that would count of equal value rather than first class, second class, and third class forms of evaluation, without falling into the trap of very rigid streaming. That's one. The other point is the importance that these very things we are talking about right now will be included as the core of leadership preparation programs and not as a frill. Thank you.
Thank you. Important points, both of them. So over to the audience. There's Philip wants to make a point.
Thanks, Jacky. I would argue that at the root of the traditional view of leadership is a philosophy of dependence. The idea that you look to a senior figure, a senior leader who will do certain things, or if they do certain things in a certain way, they will solve problems or improve the situation. And that, I would argue, is a problematic philosophy. Now, I would not say that that means that what the senior leader does or the head teacher does that is not important, and how it's done will vary in different situations. So I think the point that Jerry made, the last one, brings to the fore a very important tension or issue about how to view leadership and where it resides and what kind of thinking underpins it. Is it something that leaves people out? They have something done by avoiding deficit thinking, then that person, the student, parent, or whoever it may be, will then be in a better position, but they are dependent on another person for doing that? Or is it done within the context of a different philosophy of co-development, of codependence, of working together? I repeat, that doesn't mean that certain people don't do significant things because they have certain powers, certain resources, or whatever it may be. But I think that fundamental perspective is one that is extremely important for thinking about the issue of equity.
Thank you. Does anybody else from the audience want to come in on that? Okay, well, we'll hold that one. Anybody in the panel want to respond? Are you coming in? Giovanna.
I was thinking on the top of my mind that there is, of course, a lot of literature on equity, but a complex at the level of a school, I think that a complex design, a design of a complexity of the architecture of equity enacted, where you see the actors and the different dimensions of equity is to some extent missing. Because in fact, if you want to take into, when you were talking about gender, I was thinking of the enormous repertory of student posts that we have, where they describe themselves. And of course, we didn't ask about gender, anything specific about gender, but they were discussing, presenting their problems with respect to their peers, male peers or female peers, and they were telling a lot of very interesting things about how they perceive communication, particularly in the question, how do I express myself? You know, they were, distinguishing spontaneously between what they say with their male peers or female peers according to their gender. So I think that, thinking of this, the deep contact I now have with this enormous repertory of some 10,000 posts, and what we are doing with its analysis, that it should be important to take, when you consider these issues, ethnicity, gender, to see them from the perspectives of the different actors, because in fact they are different layers. The students, one is the level of the policies and the view from the policy perspective. Another one is the one of the teachers, and which was mentioned before, the different levels of access to the career. The levels of one is the level of the teachers, but there is also the level of the students, which is perceived in a different way.
Thank you. Another aspect, very briefly, that I think we need to consider, given the complexities in all of Europe, but also in all of the world, is the aspect of religion and spirituality and leadership. Okay, but the 2 points I wanted to make are: I've just finished teaching 72 hours of 2 units at OISE on ethics, social diversity, and leadership, and the one on democracy and leadership. And we have read Philip's work and Jacky's work and Margaret Grogan's and Karen Shields and Leeds Moves and Ken Leetwood and so on, all right? So, but 2 points that emerged in the conversations, which I think are relevant here, is someone reminded us in the conversation, Moses, who is seen as a classic leader, did not want to be in a position of leadership. He told God, you chose me? I'm so weak, okay? But one reflection. The other point is the distinction, which I think is crucial in my mind, between a conception of leadership and a style of leadership. I think what Philip is getting into, I think, is we need to consider what a conception of leadership we hold. Is it one of dependency or non-dependency? No. Within one of non-dependency, a more democratic one, a more inclusive one, a more transformative one, we may need to apply and use a variety of styles given the context. So, as our colleague from Ireland said, there are contexts where I have seen it in operation, where someone in leadership is very explicit and takes very strong direction. But all of that is done from the conception of a transformative approach, which I think puts us in a completely different picture.
One or two more questions before we try and pull everything together. So we start with Leif.
Thank you. I think that one thing we haven't focused so much on here is that when we want to talk about equity, both in respect to the students and in respect to teachers, we need also to find out and to give good advices to the politicians on how to select the head teachers or principals. Because being elected by the peers is one thing, another thing is being selected by an authority very far away from schools. And these authorities may very often have other agendas than the school itself. I think we should focus a bit on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, you've been very good. I'm sure by now you're waiting for your lunch, so we're going to try and pull things together. What I'm going to ask the panel to do is to be as disciplined as they were in their initial presentations and just to pick out the one thing that stands out for them in terms of its importance for policy in relation to equity. And we'll give the panel a chance to say what matters most to them that they've taken from this debate. If there's time, if anybody wants to add a key point or two, we'll do that. And then we'll all go and mull over some of these things and talk to each other more over lunch. So let's go in the same order we did originally. Yiannis, do you want to give us a key thing from your point?
Yes. In my opinion, what matters most and actually what has come up from this discussion is that we have to cultivate among ourselves a common vision of equity and leadership. We actually have to make a synthesis of what we think and avoid the traps, actually, that intervene in our thinking. Because actually, at some time, this complex thinking pays lip service actually to equity and leadership rather than making it happen. So this is, for me, this is the aim of PLAs like this one, that we reach a common understanding of the terms and set the lines for action. And that's my.
Thank you. That's a good point. Salvina and John, I don't know which of you wants to.
I can say that. Okay. Improving equity in education is decreasing student failure, which means we will have hopefully a fairer society and less demands on social needs, because we will have better equipped citizens. So I am hopeful to think about that. Thank you.
Briefly, very briefly. So, one, equality of opportunity is not the same as equity. Two, equity, I think, is crucial for leadership and not a frill, as we may have taught in the past. Three, I am not against inclusion, I am for inclusion, but we need to ask at the policy level who is doing the including, what criteria, and for what purpose. And finally, there are indeed possibilities for action. I have worked in schools and I have learned from them, and we have a lot to learn from them. Thank you.
I'm passing now to Giovanna.
from the debate is the importance of acknowledging difficulties and identifying the risks of a superficial implementation of equity policies. I think that policies should draw attention to the real enactment of equity policy from a variety of perspectives, or from the perspective of different actors, as I said before.
Well, for me, it's to cease talking about deficits, instead using whatever we have and using that as a leverage for really improving and changing, and also for that to have a local ownership with very, very, very carefully set, probably global and not European and national goals.
I'm the last one again. Well, for me, that's okay. Well, for me, when I think about equity or equitable schools, the issue of leadership comes up, and it's very important. And I will equate that to 3 words that I said in my presentation. And as a transformative leader who has to start at the end, I'm going to start at the bottom and talk about, first of all, awareness that we have to bring equity, or if we're not bringing it, how to bring more equity in our schools. And then, following the awareness, to constantly keep in mind that the work that we do in schools is very complex, and we have to understand that we're all interrelated, interdependent, and interconnected. And unless we have all of these parts together, parents, students, teachers, leaders, then we cannot have equity. Thank you.
Is there anybody on the floor who thinks there's some key thing that hasn't been mentioned so far that we really need to add to this debate? Kathy?
I will be very short. It's just a rhetorical question. Can we have equity in schools if we don't have equitable societies? So what I'm referring to is the connection between society and schooling. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacky.
It's a very well-made point, and it goes back to Michael's point this morning, the relationship between structure and agency. I don't think we can wait around for society to transform itself. I've been waiting for gender to transform itself all my life, and it's not happening, folks. On the other hand, we mustn't be unrealistic in what we expect of schools, I guess, is the answer to that. It's difficult to summarize all that's gone on in a very varied and rich debate. I think one of the successes of EPNoSL has been the insistence at all times that it is leadership for equity. It's not leadership as a kind of notion out there. It's for something. It's to contribute to children's lives and to make that a more equitable experience. However, as the panel has pointed out, they used the words lip service, as superficial. Just repeating the word equity doesn't make it happen. And they have pointed out that there are lessons in schools that involve students, parents, and staff from which we can learn about this continuing struggle, which isn't going to be fixed overnight, but which will go on. That it is localized, the assistance is that it is localized, and that there's a role for everybody in this localized context to try to, if not transform the world, put another brick in the wall. I think that's all any of us can hope to do. I hope that's what this panel discussion has done, with your contributions today. We've put little bricks in the wall. All of us have our aspirations, I guess. One of mine is to go to a gender conference where there are as many men as there are women. You will all have your own version of your equity aspiration. I hope what we've done today is help think about and clarify and challenge and stimulate you to carry that forward a little bit further. Now you really do deserve your lunch. So can we just finally thank the panel for their contributions?
Thank you, Jacky, for this coordination and all of the participants. Right after lunch, we will break up in workshops. Let's meet at the entrance of the terrace so that the local organizers guide you to the rooms where the different workshops will be held. And we will convene again in this room at around 4 o'clock, whatever the schedule says. So right after lunch, we gather at the entrance of the terrace. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.